Okay, welcome everyone to our latest Jubilee School session. My name is Jason Wozniak. I'm with the Debt Collective, and Debt Collective runs a popular education series called Jubilee School, where we try and get people together to talk about not only debt, but some of the things that are related to debt, the ways that higher education is run, how it could be run, the way that it relates to racial, colonial, gendered capitalism, what is the university that we want to see, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so what we've been doing for the last 5 or 6 months now, along with my colleague Julia Barnard, is we created a College for All series that's been running, and this is the latest iteration of that. We are going to hear from Kareem Matar and Jennifer Ruth. And let me just give you a little bit of the arc of the night before we get into a short introduction from both of Kareem and Jennifer, and then I'm going to turn it over to them. So what we'll have is we'll have a presentation from Kareem and Jennifer. After their presentation, which should go between 25, 30 minutes or so, we'll have a pause for questions. That said, please make use of the chat and add any questions you want in the chat as we're going along or any comments you want. So after their presentations, we'll have a pause. There'll be question and dialogue. And then the second part of the night, we'll have some very specific intervention ideas, discussions around ongoing campaigns, and then we'll have more time for a final conversation at the end. All right. So that's the arc of the show. Um, as I said, please feel free to make use of the chat as we're going along. And if you ever have a question that you want to ask or make a comment, you can write the word stack in the chat and or raise your hand and I'll try and get to you. So hopefully that works for everybody. And thank you so much for coming. I am just going to do a very informal introduction to two comrades and two friends that I've had the pleasure of working with now for, I think, over 2 years, Kareem Attar and Jennifer Ruth. Both amazing scholars, amazing organizers and activists, but more importantly, amazing people. Like, wear the heart on the sleeve. And one of the things that I admire about both Jennifer and Kareem is that they walk the walk. It's not just talk. So what you hear in analysis today is a product of struggle and a product of being in the fight. And I really admire that from both of you. I will let them, if they want to, because they're both very humble, introduce some of their publications, but they are very well published books, articles, the whole thing. You can look them up if you want to, but I wanted to keep this kind of informal and just let everyone know that we're not only in the midst of great scholars, but we're in the midst of great organizers, activists, and great people. And I'm going to leave it at that and let my friends take it over. So without any further ado, I think Kareem, you're going to start us off. Is that correct?
I thought Jennifer was going to
And
start us off.
Jennifer's going to start us off. That's why I
Yeah.
asked. All right. Thank you so much. And here we go.
Yeah, that was I thought I was going to start us off too. I'm going to actually just bear with me for a second while I turn on my timer because I do not want to go over my 15-minute allotted time and take up any of Kareem's time or any of our discussion time for sure. So first, thank you so much, Jason, for that really sweet introduction. And thank you to the Debt Collective. Thank you to Kareem for joining me. Thank you everyone for showing up. Really appreciate that. Um, Given that this is a debt collective event and a debt collective audience, I don't think I need to tell any of you that higher education in this country is bankrupt, extremely morally bankrupt, among other financially bankrupt. And what I want to do today, and that it cannot serve its democratizing function or a democratizing function uh, anymore or right now. And I want to argue today by giving you a couple of details that I think in the onslaught we've all been dealing with, maybe some of the nuances of how these playbooks of the assaults are happening, maybe getting lost, and some useful points for organizing and activism may be getting overlooked. So I want to focus specifically on the place where perhaps the moral bankruptcy is the worst, which is, in my mind, Texas, which is the tip of the spear. If the current right-wing movement to demonize higher ed is able to continue to build its momentum, if we don't have something positive in the midterm elections, what we see in Texas is very likely to play out elsewhere. Launching an AAUP committee of inquiry on Texas, similar to some of you may be familiar. The National American Association for University Professors, I serve on Committee A for Academic Freedom for AAUP and have for some time. Some of you may be familiar, for example, with the Florida report that came out a year or so ago, 2 years ago, that looked into the DeSantis Stop Woke stuff and New College. So AAUP has put together a committee of inquiry along those lines for the whole state of Texas. So I've been trying to wrap my head around what's going on in Texas and launching that committee a few weeks ago. Todd Wolfson, the president of AAUP, says, what happens in Texas does not stay in Texas. And I think that's probably true. So the main thing that I want to focus on, because it actually took a little while for it to come into clear view for myself, and so I'm assuming maybe others as well, is the really, really profoundly effective elimination of shared governance in Texas in particular, and what that is serving, what the end goal of the elimination of shared governance is all about. I think I was so startled at the fact that, for example, the entire University of Texas system, UT Austin, UT El Paso, San Antonio, UT Dallas, faculty senates are abolished completely. That fact alone, having been someone who's long served, I saw someone put in the chat that they're involved in their university faculty senate, having been on faculty senate many terms over my 25 years at Portland State, having taken quite seriously the idea that faculty should have, as an AAUP principal state, have authority over curriculum. I was so stunned by this fact that the sort of way that it happened, how it happened, and what the end goal is was kind of lost for me for a minute. And that's what I hope to explain. So, if right-wing actors can eliminate any potential, by eliminating shared governance, they eliminate, a set, of course, potential obstacles to transforming higher education pretty much wholesale. So building on the 2023 rejection of affirmative action, they can go much, much further, stripping away the democratizing gains beginning with Brown v. Board, continuing through civil rights era and into the 70s and 80s with the establishment of Black ethnic studies, women's studies, Chicano studies, sexuality and gender studies, etc. And the goal, of course, is to create a quote unquote patriotic education favoring Christian nationalist and free market ideologies. In 2015, so at least 5 states have eliminated or radically restructured, enabled the radical restructuring of their faculty senates. Texas, Indiana, Ohio, Alabama, and Wisconsin. Wisconsin was the first in 2015. I think it's useful for sort of relief to look at the differences between what Wisconsin did in 2015 and what Texas did in 2025. In 2015, Wisconsin left the election and internal structure of the faculty senates alone, but reduced them officially to, quote, just advisory bodies. As any of us who have served on faculty senate know, ultimately, that is what all of us, what the faculty senates are, advisory bodies, but to the extent that you can kind of give them teeth through threats of, loss of confidence in presidents or, various kinds of moves and motions, you can try to make the shared quality a little bit more real. But it turned them into advisory only. But it left the structures alone in Wisconsin. And Texas, the rule, SB 37, caps members of senates at 60 and requires that campus presidents, or enables campus presidents to handpick up to 50% of the Senate body and select its leadership. The scope of impact in Wisconsin in 2015, it was just the University of Wisconsin. Texas is blanket rules for every public university and college, community college system. And like I said, in 2 of the Texas systems, Texas Tech and University of Texas systems, the senates have been abolished completely. Oh, I mentioned it for University of Texas, but for Texas Tech as well, abolished completely. For all the others, they've been radically restructured. Since Texas passed SB 37, Alabama has signed House Bill 580 into law, giving university presidents and governing boards the power to take over governance bodies and limit senates to advisory roles. And relatedly, in my opinion, although not about Senates, Tennessee passed recently House Bill 2194 that strict, because relating to the idea of horizontal shared peer review, peer governance, peer authority over horizontal authority over curriculum, over hiring, et cetera. It strips the right to peer review and disciplinary procedures in Tennessee. So that's just to give you a general context where Texas fits in with the other states in terms of trying to abolish shared governance or our ability to control the means of our knowledge production and dissemination. There are 156 public colleges and universities in the state of Texas. So in sheer size alone, Texas is worth looking at. And the big issue, as I've said, is where this is headed. The elimination of shared governance eliminates potential obstacles to the transformation, particularly of undergraduate curriculum and any kind of general education or core requirements. So SB 37 includes the requirement that SB 37 was passed in September 2025. It includes Senate Bill 37. It includes the requirement that institutions regularly review their general ed curricula and that only top university leaders or their designees can be involved in decision-making regarding faculty grievance. So the same bill, SB 37, that calls for the review of general ed also has done away with the governing body in charge of general ed and undergrad curriculum, the faculty senate. Now, to understand how or why this was important to do, to get rid of the faculty senates and at the same time call for review of general ed, you actually have to go back 2 years to Senate Bill 17, passed in Texas in 2023. Senate Bill 17, these are things that we've seen in the headlines and Chronicle, et cetera. And we know that they've been passing, but how they work together may have eluded us, or at least it did me. So Senate Bill 17 abolished all of the DEI offices, all of the DEI staff, any kind of requirement of DEI statements. And so maybe we remember when that happened in 2023, and we learned about all the staff who were fired and some faculty. And at the time, Texas AAUP and AFT worked really hard to fight SB 17 and also to make sure that SB 17 did not impact academic curriculum, academics, faculty. It was only supposed to impact bad enough, only supposed to impact DEI offices and staff. Nonetheless, at the time, Texas AAUP and AFT, they worked hard to lobby. They organized lobbying campaigns across the state to try to minimize the draconian impact of SB 17. They nonetheless knew that there would be an attempt to use it to try and restrict education around race, sexuality, gender, et cetera. And lo and behold, once SB 37 passes in September, what happens? SB 17 begins to get used to review faculty syllabi and course and program curricula. So over a 4-month period in 2025, late 2025, so after SB 37 passes, and early 2026, Texas A&M, Texas Tech, and the University of Texas system. So Texas A&M, Texas Tech system, University of Texas systems all adopt policies explicitly constraining what professors can teach. The Texas A&M policy, which the board approved in November 2025, requires presidential approval of courses that will, quote, advocate race or gender ideology or topics related to sexual orientation or gender identity. In December 2025, administrators in the Texas Tech system began questioning professors as to whether a course, quote, advocates or promotes specific racial, gender, or sexual identities. The questioning occurred immediately after the December 1st memorandum from Chancellor Brandon Creighton to presidents of the system's universities stating, quote, effective immediately, faculty must not include or advocate in any form course content that conflicts with a number of prohibited standards regarding advocacy, promotion of race or sex-based prejudice. Now, I want to pause, and I don't have much more time, so actually, I'm just going to try to hit some of the things that I think are more nuanced to Texas that would have escaped people's radar elsewhere. And one is Brandon Creighton himself, because it shows us to some extent how these Republican legislatures are working to take over higher education. So the Chancellor Brandon Creighton, who issued this memorandum that I just mentioned that tries to oversee the curriculum review, he had been a Texas senator, a state senator, a Republican state senator, when he tried to pass the full SB 17, which would have affected. So the SB 17 was reduced to just DEI offices, right, in 2023. This was Creighton's Senate bill that he proposed. It got reduced, narrowed in scope from what he wanted. In 2025, right after passing SB 37, which then says we're going to look at all of general ed and we're going to abolish faculty senates, Creighton steps down from the Senate and is appointed chancellor to the Texas tech system, unanimously through Governor Greg Abbott's, intervention and influence. So Creighton leaves his career in the Senate to take over as chancellor and then do exactly what he couldn't fully do by way of legislature. So he's bypassing legislation and taking over as chancellor. And once he does, within a few weeks, he's passing regulations and executive orders that require the syllabus review and the curriculum review. So utilizing, yeah, so and requiring, one of the things that he seems to mostly care quite a bit about, is that nobody ever violate the Trump's executive order that only two sexes exist. So a lot of the curriculum review is focused on that. I want to mention in my last minute or so, yeah, okay. I want to mention one other thing that I think is a really important piece of this puzzle, which is as these Senate Bill 37 and some of the extra regulations and orders that have then been pushed out by Creighton, they allow for the elimination of courses. They allow for the stripping away of, and as we see nationwide sociology courses, English, et cetera, certainly taking them out of gen ed requirements, but then of course making them impossible to sustain on their own, and requiring that while some faculty who've been hired to teach certain things can teach those things out, they cannot, new hiring criteria have to reflect these other rules. But one of the things that I want to mention is that the way in which the new education, so how do you then, though, substitute for all of the education that the faculty who've been duly hired by their peers, chosen as the best in their areas, et cetera, as they're getting sidelined and disenfranchised, how do you make sure that the patriotic education is getting taught? And that, of course, is where we get into the civic centers. So at UT Austin, for example, the School of Civic Leadership, beginning in 2023, Harlan Crow, who some of you may remember from back when he got caught up into a scandal with Clarence Thomas for giving Clarence Thomas special luxury trips. Harlan Crow gave $100 million to UT Austin to start the School of Civic Leadership. Crow also was in the news for his his Nazi statues and Confederate memorabilia statues. He gave $100 million to UT School of Civic Leadership. The School of Civic Leadership, it has 4 different areas, free market, classics, these kinds of things, and they're creating majors. So as you eliminate them, and you have unilateral, the director of the center has unilateral control to hire, right? So the other kinds of departments, that he can hire a poli-sci faculty member, whether he has a poli-sci degree or not, right? So the center is going to, beef out its offerings, while the legitimate offerings that have happened actually through legitimate shared governance and AAUP principles and principles of academic freedom get eliminated. So that's how it's working on a couple of different levels. I'll stop there. Sorry for going a few minutes over.
No, that was such a valuable power analysis, breaking down who's doing what. So valuable. Thank you so much. And we should figure out a way to map that out, like in a chart at some point, so that we can share that out. Thank you so much, Jennifer. Kareem, you're up.
Oh, thanks so much, Jason, and thank you, Jennifer, for this incredibly detailed and thorough analysis of Texas as a microcosm and model of what is surely coming down the line, if not already implemented everywhere else in the country. It's thought-provoking, heartbreaking, and haunting, and an excellent framing for our discussion today. Thanks so much, Jason and Deck Collective, for putting this important series together. And thanks so much, all of you, for being here today. It's just wonderful and buoying for me to be in community with you. I'm going to be talking about what we can do about this state of affairs as it pertains to Palestine in particular, and the repression we've seen around Palestine since October 2023 at the very least. I'm focusing on coalition building and community-based learning. And I'm going to be reading from a script, but hopefully in the second half of the event, things can be a little bit more open and spontaneous. I'd like to start with the proposition that every single one of the fights we are currently engaged in on our campuses, in our scholarly associations, and in our unions is worth fighting, but none alone is sufficient to meet the challenges of the moment. We know what the challenges are. Jennifer has just beautifully outlined how the long-term trajectory of neoliberal austerity in American higher education has culminated in what might be considered a de facto fascist takeover of our institutions and knowledge production therein, where teaching, research, and extramural activities of students and faculty have become increasingly subservient to the ideological dictates of the state, and where academic freedom and shared governance have been exposed as the shams they always were. We know also that teaching, research, and activism related to Palestine have been ground zero for the ideological captures of our institutions in the last 3 years, at the hands of not just Republican, but also centrist and Democratic legislatures, boards, and administrators. As students, faculty, and staff has sought via education and direct action to push their institutions towards ethical policies and practices regarding programming, investments, and procurements, they have been met with repression unlike anything we have seen in the higher education sector so far. The shredding of academic freedom norms and tenure protections in response to education related to Palestine is matched only by the violence with which students protesting and actually unfolding genocide have been met, while associations and unions have repeatedly engaged in anti-democratic practices in order to stifle misstatements, let alone boycott, divestment, and sanction demands when it comes to the Israeli state's comprehensively documented violations of international law and human rights. What is it about education and action related to Palestine that is deemed so threatening to the interests of our institutions that they would undermine their own founding values and principles so as to repress them? And more importantly, what can we do about this sorry state of affairs? Clear understanding of how our universities, associations, and unions are caught within the larger discursive structures of public sentiment, corporate media, external special interest groups, party politics, national and global flows of capital and law is necessary, but insufficient to fight back. Seeing clearly how our campus challenges related to, for example, the firing of a tenured professor or the defunding of a student group are multiple levels mediated by state politics, national interests, and international warfare is again necessary, but insufficient. What I feel is required is a set of mechanisms by which the knowledge that can still be most thoroughly generated within our institutions of higher learning is translated into meaningful change. Such mechanisms, it seems to me, emerge spontaneously at the interstices between the private institution and the public sphere, between the role of scholar and activist, between education and action, and between otherwise divergent movements, groups, and communities. Guided by the model and the inspiration of the Gaza Solidarity encampments, I would like to devote the remainder of my time to highlighting two such mechanisms which I have been involved in the last 3 years: coalition building on a national scale and community-based learning. So to start with the first of these, since the fall of 23, and directly in response to the federally mandated attacks on students, faculty, and staff protesting the Gaza genocide, the Coalition for Action in Higher Education has been building coalition for a free higher education in the United States, a higher education that is freely accessible to the public and that is free of political interference. Our 35 plus partner organizations include higher education unions such as AAUP, Higher Education Labor United, and Debt Collective, scholarly associations such as the American Comparative Literature Association, the Middle East Studies Association, and Association for Postcolonial Thought, and activist groups such as Sanctuary Campus Network and Scholars for Social Justice. Our flagship initiative is the National Day of Action for Higher Education, a yearly event for free higher education that takes place on campuses around the country. And throughout the year, our other activities are focalized around Palestine, Who Rules the Academy, anti-fascism, and soon AI and technology caucuses. Many members and leaders of these caucuses are here today. The caucus's explicit mandate is to link the individual challenges their members face on their campuses with wider national and international trends, and to pursue intersectional forms of political education, advocacy, and direct action in response. It is here, I think, that in Kai's 3 and soon 4 caucuses that the power of coalition building as a mechanism for addressing the challenges we are facing becomes apparent. Attuned and responsive to the individual challenges reported in caucus meetings by their members, the caucuses are able to bring the collective expertise and experience of coalition partners to understanding them systematically as nodes or flashpoints embedded within larger structures of power, and thus to addressing them systematically in relation to the whole of which they are a part. At the same time, individual instances of repression, harassment, targeting, abuse, and more inform the work of coalition partners in their own organizations in an expanding dialectic of a rapidly unfolding situation. I'd like to draw on one example from the Palestine caucus to illustrate the above. In the fall of 2025, the Palestine caucus ran a political education series on mapping anti-Palestinian discrimination, harassment, and misinformation in US higher education. The series, itself an act of coalition building and of public knowledge creation, drew on the experiences of caucus members and the expertise of coalition partners, including AUP, Jewish Voice for Peace, Faculty of Staff for Justice in Palestine, Palestine Legal, the BDS Movement, Labor for Palestine, Democratic Socialists of America, and more, to shed light on the systematic and orchestrated nature of the attacks and to point towards avenues of recourse in our institutions, in our unions, and in the law. For example, it traced the origins of the IRA definition, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism, the ways in which this definition has been weaponized by external special interest groups such as the Anti-Defamation League, and its federally imposed implementation on campuses around the country. Partners from JVP, Participatory Action Research Network, Institute for the Critical Studies of Zionism, Drop the ADL, and elsewhere critically contested IRA based on their deep expertise and rigorous research into the actual history and manifestations of anti-Semitism, and foregrounded their own critical work, alternative trainings, and activist initiatives as part of a broad network of possible responses. The act of standing up and speaking out together on this by the series embodied the coalitional ethos I believe is requisite to fight back collectively and effectively. I'll move on to community-based learning now. As we know, large segments of the American public have become alienated and disenfranchised from the very idea of higher education, let alone from the form and content of the knowledge produced therein. I attribute this to the politics of and economics of neoliberal austerity, by which higher education has been rendered inaccessible to the majority of Americans. Certainly, as alluded to above, part, if not the central aim of our coalitional project is to push towards restored public funding for higher education. In the meantime, I feel it is very important to find innovative ways to bring the knowledge otherwise gate-kept for those who have the means to access it into the public sphere. When it comes to issues like Palestine, such forms of public knowledge creation are in themselves essential public goods, even services, which I feel are part of my job as an employee of a public institution to pursue. But by bringing so-called academic knowledge into the public sphere, we can, I think, help restore trust in institutions of higher education and bring communities into the service of defending and ultimately transforming them. I'll draw on the example of my work at the First Unitarian Society of Denver to briefly illustrate this. In the spring of 2024, public interest in and outrage about Palestine and the US was at an all-time high. Met with daily images of atrocities piled upon atrocities delivered through non-traditional media sources, something, it seemed, had snapped in the American national psyche. and communities were increasingly asking questions about their country's support for and participation in the crimes that were unfolding in front of their eyes. A-religious, my wife and I attended an interfaith service for Gaza at the FUSD congregation near our home in Denver, and soon connected with congregation members and representatives of local chapters of JVP, Students for Justice in Palestine, Young Democratic Socialists of America, and other activist groups in attendance. We formed a Middle East Justice Committee in that historically progressive space and began to put together programming on Palestine, drawing on the collective expertise of our group of academics and activists, reverends, and rabbis. Organically emerging from the Denver community, and yet grounded in combined decades of professional scholarship on Palestinian history, politics, and culture, the knowledge that was produced in our programming helped link a far-flung human catastrophe with the politics and social dynamics of the local in quite immediate ways. Attuned to prevailing misconceptions and historically mediated misinformation, our first series was a free 5-week community course on justice in Israel and Palestine. With our 80 to 200 attendees at each session, we sequentially worked through the nature and extent of the current Gaza genocide, the history of Palestine from 1896, the date of publication of Theodor Herzl's The Jewish State, to the present day, the history of Zionism and its inherently racist, Orientalist, and colonial underpinnings, the weaponization of accusations of anti-Semitism.
What about your guest coming?
She's not coming.
Oh,
I
okay.
didn't have time to tell you.
I'm sorry she's not coming, but okay, we'll continue otherwise. And practices of solidarity and activism from the local to the global. For me personally, the series was deeply grounding. At a time of inconsolable anguish, it helped me feel grounded in a community of understanding, empathy, and solidarity. And I feel very much the same way about my Kahi colleagues, Jason, Jennifer, Edna, Shamal, and others. I'm not sure if there are any others in this room, but many others. At a time of helplessness, it helped me feel useful. The intimacies of in-person, while often challenging, are also incomparably nurturing and sustaining. Moreover, the series, grounded in concrete knowledge, helped build community and directed towards concrete forms of political advocacy and direct action. Our Summer 2024 Palestine Summer Cultural Program and Fall 2024 Palestine and its Intersections with Contemporary US Issues series kept the momentum going, but since then, as we've seen elsewhere, it has dropped off considerably. My sense in general is that the ebb and flow of public interest and engagement is natural and connected to geopolitical developments, media coverage, and attrition, but also that the base has coalesced and grown and has become an indisputable political force in its own right. I think we see this in votes on the House floor yesterday, where I think 103 Democrats voted to suspend military funding for Israel, along with Thomas Massie from the Republican Party, who forwarded this resolution. I'll conclude with a few abstract and general reflections on public knowledge creation. I think I'm well within time, surprisingly for me. Knowledge is not created in a building or an institution. Rather, it manifests as an event. And I mean event in the Badiouist sense here. As in the Gaza Solidarity encampments, its first and last home, it is unprecedented and spontaneous. It is unforeseen and unforeseeable, coalitional in nature and grounded in the intimacies of the human voice, the human touch. It emerges at the interstices between the private and the public, between the scholar and the activist, between education and action, and between movements, groups, and communities. It is a point of intersection between needs, desires, and demands. Perhaps in the last instance, knowledge comes from Palestine itself, from the encampment that has been made of Palestinian life from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea, transgressing all of the boundaries of thought, speech, and action that have been imposed upon us by history and by hate. Knowledge of Palestine is knowledge of the nature of our world. Brutal to be sure, this knowledge yet carries within it the seeds of our collective liberation. Thank you so much. I'll leave it there.
Bravo to both of you. Fantastic. And so much to think about, so much to feel. Let's see if we can make an event happen here. Um, the way we can go about this is if you would like to make a comment and or ask a question out loud, please write the word stack or raise your hand and I'll find you on the screen. You can also post your questions in the chat. So go ahead and take a moment to reflect on that. As we're waiting, maybe I can pose something that to both Jennifer and Cream that came up, and I think they're related, although maybe you can help me make the connection. The first would be a question that we keep coming up against in their series of College for All, where we're talking about like what would a free autonomous public university at least look like in the United States. There is a question of autonomy, and all of the different programs for a free public university usually involve funding from the state, right? But here we have Jennifer, and I think Kareem also touched on this, pointing out very clearly that once you're dependent on the state can do all sorts of things. And Texas was used as an example, correct? So on the one hand, there's a question of autonomy. Sorry, someone just came to my door. And then there's another question that Kareem, you made me think about, and I want to push you in the most friendly way about the notion of emergence and mechanisms by which knowledge and action emerge spontaneously. Because one of the things I think you're pointing out is that we need some sort of organizational form for some of these emergences to occur. And whether that be a caucus or a coalition, whether that be the place we call a university or a place we call the church, it still seems like there's this issue of for the event to happen, we have to create certain conditions. And for the conditions to exist, we need some sort of form to make that possible. So I just want to put that out there because I do think that comes back to autonomy in the sense where, if you have a state that's taking over that form, they're not going to allow for that emergence. I guess that's how I would make the connection. So just some initial thoughts, and then please, if others jump in with more interesting questions and or comments, that'd be amazing.
Can I say a few things about the autonomy thing? Because I think that's one of the most sort of dramatic lessons to take is that the neoliberal austerity that essentially shifted public education was supposed to be subsidized by the state, and it was supposed to be, democratized and made for everybody. And of course, I'm at Portland State University, a state university that when my someone my age would have been going to school, it would have been quite cheap. But of course, the state started investing less and less in its universities, and essentially that we have the privatization of public universities. So the neoliberalism set us up so that it wasn't going to be free public education for all or even subsidized. And then what we've seen in the last few years is exactly as Jason said, and is exactly as we see in Texas, is that even aside from the neoliberalism, when the state has this kind of control, the state can take over in profound ways. And one of the incredible ironies is that the First Amendment for public universities applied to public universities, not to private. But we're seeing the fascist takeover of public universities and the control of faculty speech and student speech. And what we're seeing in is what we're going to have to wait and see is if this is how well this is going to be challenged in law, and that's going to take time. So, for example, National AAUP is working with Texas AAUP AFT has brought a lawsuit against Texas tech system, university system, and it's listing the First Amendment as one of its major premises for its lawsuit. The problem is what Texas is going to argue. So the First Amendment, speech against the state has to be allowed by the state. A private institution doesn't have to can control speech to a degree that a public institution is not supposed to be allowed to control. So we should be able to criticize other nation states, Israel, and we should be able to criticize our own nation state in public universities. Private universities can have different sets of rules. Public universities are not supposed to. That has not changed the fact that beginning in 2020, two, basically, in the attack on critical race theory, it's been public institutions and that have been controlling speech and faculty and curriculum around criticism of U.S. or Israel. Okay, so as far as the law goes, there's First Amendment challenges to these, but the problem is that there was something called Garcetti versus I can't remember how to say the other guy's name, Cibolis, in 2006 that ruled that a state employee speech pursuant to a state employee's duties are not protected. At the time, there was a couple of judges had in their minority, rulings or reports or addendums that, of course, we're not saying anything about higher education, because what would it mean for us to say that a faculty member's speech is always pursuant to the state's duties and can be subordinated to a supervisor? A supervisor can control what a employee says. What would that would just completely destroy higher education. So there was this question mark around that and a kind of carve out, but not an official and carve out with teeth for higher education. Recently, in doing research on Texas, I watched a hearing that was convened by a Texas Select Committee on Civil Discourse and Free Speech in Higher Education that was convened by Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick right after Charlie Kirk's assassination in order to go after faculty and students who were critical of Charlie Kirk. So, but at this hearing, the Texas Attorney General made clear that they apply Garcetti to public education faculty. So, speech by faculty is pursuant to duties and is unprotected speech, the Texas AG said. So what we're going to have to see is if the AAUP lawsuit plays out and whether the Texas AG's Garcetti or other notions, Sweezy, Frankfurt, etc., of academic freedom and higher education win the day. Meanwhile, as things play out in law, I think we have no choice but to not turn to the state in any way to begin to create genuine forms of education, higher education, adult learning, democratized education. So through things like Scholars for Social Justice that are already doing and other kinds of ways, with very little money and with as much fundraising as possible, it will be private, the private sector. Will not be the public sector that begins to build an alternative forms of education right now.
Okay, chew on that one, everybody. Wow.
Yeah,
All
yeah,
right.
yeah.
Kareem, what do you think?
That's incredible. I want to spend another year chewing on that one. In the meantime, I want to respond to the wonderful tension you were bringing out in my talk between mechanism, or better, perhaps structure, and event. The Gaza Solidarity Encampment, of course, was unprecedented, unforeseen. Nobody could have seen that coming. To the extent that it emerged in the United States, starting at Columbia on April the 17th, 2024. And throughout the world. Nobody could have foreseen the kinds of work going on in these encampments that were not just protesting a genocide, that were not just pushing back against the institution's complicity with war crimes and crimes against humanity, but were engaging in grassroots forms of political education on the ground. However, as I think you put it, Jason, the conditions for the emergence of such a movement, led as always by the students, were prepared decades previously. The decades of education in academia, in the public sphere, in the cultural sphere around Palestine, and all of the challenges that our predecessors like Edward Said, Rashid Khalidi, and Ilan Papi in the Israeli educational context faced in order to get knowledge and truth out into the public sphere, created the educational conditions and the understanding among the generations of students that coalesced around April the 17th, 2024, and gave them the impetus and the momentum to be able to pursue the radical act of democratic decentering and recentering of what knowledge creation is and looks like in the United States. Also, the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement that has been working globally since 2005 to to, on the basis of international law, delegitimize the Israeli state and Israeli institutions complicit with war crimes. Um, gave the students a specific strategy, a specific set of political demands that they could pursue individually on their own campuses. So I think what we do at the moment, and we have to keep this in mind when we're building coalitional structures, is create the conditions via political education, via advocacy, and via direct action for something that is unforeseen and unforeseeable around the Palestine situation to emerge. We continue pushing, we continue building, we pay homage to our predecessors while looking towards the unanticipated future generation through whom actual change might occur. And I remain optimistic, perhaps naively so, but the Gaza Solidarity encampments gives me the basis for which to remain hopeful in the future, in al-mustaqbal, as we say in Arabic. The timely
Thank you.
question I'll come back to in a year.
Yeah, and things are heating up because we have two very good questions in the chat that I want to allow us a little bit of time to talk about. And I think they're kind of related if you look at them carefully. I don't know if Debt Collective member, if you want to read or speak your question out loud. And then Kylie, I don't know. Yeah, I offer the same to you. So Debt Collective member, if you want to come off mute and read it, go ahead, and or I can read it out loud just so that we have a reading rather than just the word. Okay. Okay, so I'm going to read this out loud. I love this question. It's actually a question I've thought a ton about as well. So, Debt Collective member asks, can you speak more about how unions are or aren't bridging the gap between K through 12 teachers who are all higher ed alumni and current university faculty? So is there a bridge between K-12 and higher ed is what I understand this to mean. Both are experiencing these curricular attacks, and the success at one level fuels the other. I just want to say, besides Kareem and Jennifer, if other people want to come off chat and contribute, because there's a ton of knowledge and experience in this room just from folks that I know, and there's others in here who I don't know, but I'm sure you have a lot to say on this. Please do put your name in stack, and we can offer a dialogue as well, which would be great. But Jennifer and Kareem, I don't know if you have anything to say about this question. Anyone else?
Well, the immediate thought that comes to my mind is the recent merger between American Association of University Professors and the American Federation of Teachers. AFT has effectively incorporated AUP as its higher education wing, which is raising the specter of intra-union politics, with AFT leadership increasingly pressurizing AUP leadership on positions regarding Palestine and other potentially divisive issues. There's creating tension among members of both these organizations, tensions which are coming to a head literally today. As the AFT, I think it's a biennial convention, is taking place, and as other colleagues of ours from Coalition for Action in Higher Education are attending. The K through 12 unions, such as AFT, are responsive to literally millions of members around the country, and they have resources that are necessary for AEUP to do their work, which is part of the political and economic pressure they place upon them. However, subservient to the millions of members and the various issues that they're facing on their own in their own schools, in their own communities. I think the politics of working together and bridging the gap, as Debt Collective member one is talking about, becomes very murky and problematic indeed. I'll leave it there and give space for Jennifer and others to further comment.
Jennifer, do you want to offer up anything or anyone else on this question? Then we'll go to Kylie's question.
Anybody else? I agree with Jason that I can tell from recognizing people that we have a lot of expertise on this call. It looks like Bruce has his.
It's interesting because there are definitely mechanisms for it. Whether it's, the fact that my union, United University Professions, which is the SUNY Faculty and Professionals Union, has delegates who go to the NICET the New York State United Teachers, so we're an affiliate of NYSUT and we're an affiliate of AFT. But because we're the smaller union, we're subsidiary, right? And we're not as influential on the statewide or the national policies. Now you see more convergence, right? And you see the CUNY union, PSC, Professional Staff Congress, and UUP acting in coalition to influence NYSUT and AFT. There are also these regional cross-union uh, organizational structures, like say the Dunkirk Area Labor Federation. Um, those tend to be coalitions of the willing and very locally based. So there's more opportunities there on paper, but it would take concerted action to kind of get them to do something, I think. Higher Education Labor United would be a third venue for this, and I think that might be the most promising because that idea of a wall-to-wall, coast-to-coast united university worker movement across all roles and responsibilities. That one seems to be attracting the most activist-oriented people in all the unions that are part of it, and has a lot of buy-in from major unions, major higher ed unions in the Northeast, especially. So they're a newish organization that's trying to figure out how to become more influential on the federal level and also in, key campaigns around the country. They've published a vision for the future of higher ed and a platform that I was glad to see AAUP and AFT mostly adopt. So I think HELU might be the most promising of those three avenues that I just noted.
Thank you, Bruce. I want to mention one thing that came up. So I was at the AAUP Biennial in Chicago, and one of the guest speakers was Stacey Davis Gates, who's the president of Chicago Teachers Union. And one of the things that she encouraged everyone in the room, which was mainly made up of academic faculty, to think about was we have to find common cause between K-12 and higher ed, and then we have to build coalition around that cause. But she also mentioned a really important thing that I think we learned from K-12 more so than higher ed, which is that Chicago Teachers Union, other unions in the K-12 sector use what they call bargaining for the common good tactics and other strategies for negotiation. And what that means is they talk to community about what the community needs them to bring to the negotiation table when they go up for a contract renegotiation. So in Chicago, you say, hey, we need more school counselors, we need rent control, et cetera, et cetera. The union brings that to the table. They fight with and for the community for that. And then when they go on strike, they have community backing. In other words, if we find common cause, what's the common cause not only between, as Debt Collective member astutely asked, K-12 and higher ed, but also community? And then how do we bring that to the struggle in a united front? So I think this is a fantastic question. I think it lends nicely into Kylie's question as well, which I want to get to. And Kylie's at work. Thank you for joining us at work. That's actually a beautiful gesture. I love it. Talk about emerging knowledge, right? So Kylie asks, I'll read this for Kylie. In relation to Kareem's great comments about coalition building, I was wondering if anyone here has had experience with coalition building, not just between academic groups per se, but also between different labor unions, such as, for example, a university's AAUP chapter and its SEIU chapter, or other labor unions surrounding or adjacent to the university. How might we build our power within a university by also building power within the city at large with non-higher ed groups, for example? This might be the million-dollar question. Anyone in the room have thoughts? Not to put all the pressure on Kareem and Jennifer. Again, put your name on stack. Deb, I don't know, is this related to the question? And if so, do you want to mention what you just typed in the chat?
Sure. Yeah, I'm at the University of Alaska Anchorage, and also I'm very involved in the union here. I'm a representative assembly member, and so this is something I do aside from the union part, but over the last 3 years, I've organized different panel discussions that try to bring people together to talk about more complex issues. And I think it's really helpful because in social media, we have such a mediatized rage and short answers, and it gets kind of divisive. And I think that if there's some sort of, I don't know, perhaps there's a curriculum that can be shared or disseminated that can bring people that models bringing people together to have these conversations around a popular topic that engages like the gender roles in the Barbie movie, or I did one on Sinners, which was really interesting because there was a lot of great discussion around Mary's character, and you get different people that share their human experiences as well. And I mean, it evolves into a educational critical connection and understanding. You know what I mean? That because I think otherwise we're just like us versus them, and everything seems very politicized. But we
Mhm.
have to kind of use higher education, I think, to bridge that gap. And I guess in the library, I have a really good opportunity to do that. Now, on the other side, I'm also going to just mention with our my involvement with the union. I also went to Chicago for that event, but um, we've been organizing specifically different events related to like discussions about topics we hear our union members, our faculty, our express interest on, like the chairs or imbalanced workload or different concerns. But I was thinking too, we're gonna be organizing more around the inviting other University of Alaska unions into the conversation for some of these Zoom discussions, like get to know your board or explore the debt, around like where is the money,
Mhm.
we're going at the university and things like that. I mean, because we all are like they're really being our staff just unionized and they're really pushing back against that too and being very divisive. The administration is dividing and creating this us versus them kind of mentality between unionized staff and ununionized staff. And I just don't, there's got to be a way to find again that human connection with everyone. So I'm kind of, that's my goal too, more as a representative assembly member.
Thank you, Deb. And before I go to Ellen, so it sounds like you're using the union as a forum to do some of this popular edge education, knowledge emergence, production, et cetera, and bridging the gaps between the inside and the outside of formal institutions. So thank you for that work. Ellen, you're up.
Now you can hear me.
Yep.
I'm a historian, a member of a group called Historians for Peace and Democracy, HPAD. We formed way back when, before I was involved in it, in opposition to the Iraq War, and we've been struggling within our profession ever since, usually through resolutions at the annual meeting. And you may have heard about what we tried to do, get resolutions about the genocide in Palestine before the membership, and were stymied 2 years in a row by the leadership of the organization, refusing to send the resolution that the business meeting had um, passed overwhelmingly to the members, but instead vetoing it. And so a group of us decided to try to operate democratically, and we ran as a slate, and we have just learned that we have lost the election. They haven't told us by what uh, margin, and my hunch is they're never going to tell us that. But anyhow, what we're thinking of doing, since a number of scholarly organizations like the American Historical Association, like the Modern Language Association, like the American Sociological Association, et cetera, are behaving in the same undemocratic way, we're thinking of forming a coalition of uh, people within their disciplines, uh, somebody like myself who can't form a union, and anyhow, I'm retired, uh, doing um, having another organizational outlet. As historians, there are a lot of issues that our uh, scholarly association, our official scholarly association, is not dealing with. And I'm not talking just about Palestine. Believe me, there are other issues as well. Um, and seeing what we can do as scholars within our disciplines, dealing with some of the problems that everybody in higher education is dealing with now. In other words, if you've got an organization somewhere out there, why not work within it and see what you can do? So we're thinking very seriously about holding some kind of meeting to talk about this, maybe putting on a webinar or something in the fall, but just hoping that people who find themselves invested in their fields, as I do. I mean, I consider myself a historian, and I consider my historical work my political work, and I don't want my disciplinary society to be so undemocratic. So, anyhow, just wanted to bring people up to date and think and have people think about other organizational forms you can operate through.
Thank you so much for that. And I think that's becoming a big part of this talk tonight, which is fantastic because we gathered, to talk about the university. And here we have this, it's broadening out to this. And I think, Kareem, you started this, thankfully. But like, what are the organizational forms in which some of this resistance and knowledge production happens? Thank you for that contribution. We have Tim Kaufman Osborne who wants to say something about a comment that Jennifer raised.
Yeah, my comment is not directly related to the conversation we've just been having, so I apologize for that. But I did want to push back a little bit on Jennifer's earlier claim about the problematic character of any turn to the state to save higher education. On the one hand, I'm inclined fully to endorse that. On the other hand, I'm inclined to say yes, but. And the but part, just two indications of why I would add that but part. And I think Bruce just raised this in the chat, but there was, I think it was earlier this week, an 11th Circuit ruling on the injunction that prevented enforcement of the Stop Woke Act in Florida. And it expressly denied the claim that faculty at public institutions, their speech is identical to government employee speech and hence subject to the same constraints that clerks at the DMV, for example, would be subject to. So there's a pretty accurate, so there's an affirmation that faculty speech is different in kind and hence is entitled to protections of academic freedom that are not extended to other government employees. It is, as Bruce indicates, a really important ruling. Whether the state of Florida will appeal that ruling to the U.S. Supreme Court, I think, is an open question. I don't have a whole, right, Jennifer's point about be careful about relying on the state may be reaffirmed if this in fact gets to the U.S. Supreme Court and it rules as we might expect. In any event, there's at least one promising legal development in recent days that I think is worth keeping in mind. The other thing on the question of autonomy, in the vast majority of states in the United States, higher education is defined in state constitutions as the responsibility of and hence subject to statutory regulation by legislatures. But there are a few states, Montana, Michigan, California, Minnesota being the examples I can think of off the top of my head, where the state constitutions basically carve out a separate place for higher education and ascribe to it a measure of autonomy that is not afforded to higher education in other states. So higher education and its regulation becomes something akin to a fourth branch of government. That's not quite the right analogy, but it's not bad either. I'll give you one quick example. There was a case in Montana a few years back where where the University of Montana had adopted a no concealed weapons policy on campus. The state legislature then passed a statute denying the university the authority to impose that regulation. University of Montana appealed to the Montana State Supreme Court. Montana State Supreme Court ruled that the regulation of higher education in that state is protected by constitutional autonomy and therefore upheld the university's authority to prohibit concealed weapons on campus. So those are two ways in which some measure of pushback is possible within the confines of the current state regulation of higher education. On balance, however, I'm inclined to agree with Jennifer. It's not a hopeful, turning to the state is not a hopeful enterprise.
Thank you.
That's it.
Jennifer, what do you want to say to this?
Yeah, a couple of things. First of all, we haven't even gotten to this question of who's appointing the very thing that Tim can speak to better than any of us. Who's appointing the Board of Regents? Who's appointing the trustees? What does that have to do with state politics? And so that problematic nature of the state that I just want to mention my experience having been paying attention to the very first anti-CRT bills and being involved with the African American Policy Forum when we were trying to meet and figure out how to push back, and remembering how hard it was for people to take those bills seriously because of the First Amendment, and how hard it was for us to take even the Ron DeSantis stuff, the Stop Woke stuff seriously, and how much time has passed since, right? And how much damage has been done since. So part of my point, which you weren't, disagreeing with, Tim, but part of my point was just that things play out in the courts take a long time. And so in the meantime, if we want to start to help people who have been, who've not been granted tenure because they do LGBTQ stuff or race stuff, or help people who've been dismissed for their pro-Palestine, for their actual scholarship on settler colonialism or something. If we want to start to build things with that expertise that is disappearing from the universities, we're going to have to at least start without turning to the state. One thing I want to mention, Deb, I was particularly interested in the Deb who's at University of North Texas. So I'm thank you for your email because I'm really, as you can see, very interested in what's going on in Texas. And one of the things that Deb mentioned in the chat, and that speaks to this sense of union coalition building and cross organizing and how to get at bigger coalitions that aren't just specific to higher ed, K through 12 and higher ed, is the Texas State Employees Union and the Texas AAUP-AFT. I recently spoke with Tom Alter, who I'm sure is familiar to many of you, and having been dismissed by Texas State, he has a lawsuit coming, and he told me about how well AAUP-AFT and Texas State Employee Union Board work together and don't get territorial. And so you've got staff who are with the Texas State Employee Union Board, and the degree to which many of the members, for one, are also members of the other. And a lot of the attacks that we're seeing are beginning because they're making common targets of all of us, are beginning to kind of inspire cross-coalition defensive work. And so you see that with Texas State Employee Union Board. For me, I'll just finish on this, as to take us back to the K through 12 stuff. For me in Portland, Oregon, the best organizing that crossed coalitions, that crossed boundaries, either higher ed, K through 12 boundaries, university, gown and towns boundaries, has been Palestine. I mean, there's just been an incredible faculty and staff for justice in Palestine takes from all of the different unions on our campus, and thus led to organizing between the unions, even when it wasn't specific to Palestine, Kahi event that we held at Portland State 2 years ago had a very strong PPS, Portland Public Schools contingent, and labor and health and nurses for Palestine. It was held on the Portland State campus, but it had so much of the public involved. And I've been seeing a lot of that by way of Palestine, and we just have to build on it. And just to end again where I began with Texas, one of the things that I think is interesting in terms of K through 12 and higher ed is the degree to which we have all been a victim of a new narrative of infantilizing college age students. So the Parents Defending Education was a Moms for Liberty type group that was focused on K through 12. It expanded into higher ed. In Texas, you see Texas Public Policy Foundation has a whole parent empowerment, a whole arm that's about parent empowerment. And if you've been following the Texas politicians' rhetoric closely, there's a lot of calling out to parents, whether it's about K through 12 or about higher ed. And then if you look at the money element of that, the attempts to get rid of public education altogether through the school voucher system, which was a hardcore Republican campaign priority in Texas, is very, very closely tied up with the attacks on so-called indoctrination at the higher ed level. So the intersections are very strong, and our coalitions need to be as strong.
Thank you, Jennifer. I see Ellen, and then I'm going to pass it over to Kareem and Jennifer to just give us a couple bullet points on other forms of intervention. I feel like we've really seamlessly blended the two so far, which is great. But Ellen, real quick.
Okay, very quickly. Also, we should think about progressive politicians. There are a lot more of them out there. They're being elected. Obviously, I'm in New York, the center of all kinds of horrible communist things that are happening there, like, telling us to not destroy the electrical grid and things like that. Amazing. But anyhow, um, there are politicians out there. They may want to become involved in educational issues. People are interested in educational issues. And I wonder if sort of as we organize and as we work through our own organizations, we try to think about finding us a few people within Congress. I'm thinking now we're pretty friendly, HPAD is, with Brad Lander. Well, I think he's going to be a congressman and he might be very interested in helping out with education. So there are lots of allies that maybe we haven't thought about.
Yeah, and to that point, Debt Collective had what we call a debtors assembly 2 nights ago in New York City or Mamdanistan. And Claire Valdez was there, who will be elected soon enough, and was also plainly and clearly called out for debt abolition and free college at CUNY. So there are some interesting things to happen. Kareem and Jennifer, if you could give us a couple bullet points on any other interventions that I know you prepared, and you probably already might have heard some of them, covered some of them, but anything else that came to mind as you were preparing for this would be really lovely to close us out. We have about 11 minutes to go.
Sure. I mean, I mentioned in my remarks the decline of public interest in the Palestine question, which we've seen rebound onto universities in intersection with the massive repression students and faculty and staff members have been facing. So a big organizing question within the sphere of Palestine organizing has been how to tap into that energy that has become increasingly dormant due to the conditions, how to re-energize the solidarity movement and the BDS movement on campuses. With an eye towards addressing it, a coalition comprised of the Kahi Palestine Caucus, Jewish Voice for Peace, Students for Justice in Palestine, BDS movement, and others are in the process of developing what we're calling the Educational Freedom in Palestine Virtual Campus Tour, which we're hoping to launch in the fall semester. The idea behind this is to bring students, faculty, and staff based in Palestine, based in higher education institutions, even if they're just tents at the moment in Gaza, in Palestine, virtually to US campuses for a series of in-person events across the country, wherein campus communities in the United States and in fact in Canada as well can hear directly from their peers and colleagues on the ground in Palestine and about the educational conditions that they're facing in the midst of untold oppression and the systematic physical destruction of their institutions, where they can reassert community and presence on their campuses, and where they can work together to find new innovative ways to address their own institutions' complicity in human rights violations and other violations of international law via their investments in procurements and curricula and programming and so forth. So there's something that we're putting together. We're very excited about it. We're very hopeful for it. And reports from leaders and Students for Justice in Palestine suggest that the students are ready to come back to these forms of direct action and programming on their own campuses after having been shell-shocked by the repression and the violence they've experienced the last couple of years. So yeah, like I say, very excited about this, and please stay tuned for further updates in the coming weeks.
I was just going to say, keep us posted about when this comes to fruition. And there's people all across the country, even Alaska, on this call. So thank you. Jennifer, anything you want to say about any other type of tactic or strategy?
Honestly, as my good friends who are on this call know, I have had a family issue for the last 7, 8 months, and I am not in touch with a lot of stuff. And so I actually want to throw it back to you, Jason, and Debt Collective, and for you to pitch some of the next Debt Collective stuff or things that you've been hearing on any of the Jubilee school classes that you think is promising.
Okay, wow. I wasn't ready for that, but thank you for that. If other Debt Collective people on the call want to mention, I will say a couple things. One is that one of our ideas is that debt itself is a vector line that cuts through a lot of the things we're talking about, right? Like there's a way where debt can connect some of the struggles, whether it be Palestine, whether it be race, whether it be gender, whether it be obviously class. And in particular, there's a huge interest in how higher ed and K through 12 unions address that vector line, right? Like where do we sit on that? But yeah, there are several campaigns. One is we are actively engaging in a payment pause campaign. The student loan repayment restart is a total shit show. It's chaos. It's driving people into utter poverty. There is no way in hell that we should have the payments, student loan payments, restart in this form, in any form actually. But so we're trying to get a payment pause campaign off the ground, and we're making progress. There are some people, I can't really necessarily say who right now, but there is some momentum to try and push for a pause, and the idea being we pause until we can liberate, right? So how do we get that pause? That's one thing that's actively going on. Debt Collective is also a part of some of these coalitions that came up today, including Higher Education Labor United and AAUP. But one of the things that's also going on is a midterm push to get people to sign on to a pledge that says, I support free public universities. So there is that type of work. Debt Collective doesn't just address student debt. Debt Collective addresses medical debt, housing debt, lunch debt, all sorts of other debt types. So do please, Dr. Shamel Bell just posted a list of our events, and there's plenty of ways to plug in to come and listen to some of these campaigns, to be engaged in some of these campaigns. And it would be, we would love to hear more from you. But yeah, I think those are some things that we're doing. Obviously, I think this is a good moment to plug next week's Jubilee School, which is directly related to a lot of what we were talking about today, with a really specific case example of CUNY in New York City. So as some of the historians here know better than I do, CUNY used to be free and it was open access. It was, the people's university. So we're going to have a conversation next week about how CUNY, the fight for a free CUNY was won, and importantly, how it was taken away, and then how we're going to win it again. So CUNY is a nice battleground to think through. There's others, as some of us know, California, etc. So we're going to really get into the CUNY case next week. It is the 50th anniversary of the winning of the free CUNY for all. So it's a nice time to be doing this. So we're going to continue to do that popular public education, and we hope that many people here can join us and tell your friends. But I just want to start to wrap things up by saying thank you so much, Kareem. Thank you so much, Jennifer. This was fantastic. It was a brilliant conversation. So many questions came up that we need to keep thinking about, that we need to keep strategizing about. Thank you to all the participation from the audience. You really added wonderful elements to the conversation tonight. And I think, Kareem, this is, I hope, an example of what you were talking about, where we get together, we create the conditions for events of knowledge production, thinking and feeling to happen. And thank you both for inspiring that. So with that, let's call it a night. See you on the next show.
Thank you,
Take care,
Jason.
everybody. Thank
Thanks,
you.
everybody.